For people who don't know your work, could you just say like who you are, what you do, and then this book that we're gonna kind of use as a launching pad into the conversation?
Sure. So I'm Cara. I am a pediatrician. I worked in a pediatric office for many years in my hometown of Los Angeles. And then when my kids were young, I made a pivot from working in primary care to writing. And I ended up kind of falling into this very lucky world of initially rewriting the original Care and Keeping of You book, which is a cult classic book that was published, actually first published when I was training to be a pediatrician.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so it's been around since I've been in medicine, and I had the privilege of rewriting it, updating it, and then blowing out a whole series. And so now we have 4 books in the series, and one of those books is a boy book called Guy Stuff, and it's a book that I actually pitched from my very first meeting at American Girl, because I don't believe that puberty is as gendered as people make it. Puberty is about a transforming body and hormones, which are chemicals that flood your body and your brain. And there are all these impacts. And yeah, the parts are different, but that's a teeny tiny bit of puberty. And it took about 5 years, but I got American Girl on board.
You're like,
And
I was persistent. It was going to
I went there
happen.
like, what will shut you up? Oh, but, you know, what's amazing is they looked at me the first day and they're like, you do know our company is American Girl, right? And I
You're
was
like, yeah, I do.
Yeah, I do. Thanks.
But You're like, I know how to read.
Yeah, they're an amazing. I got to just.
Yeah, I'm not insulting.
Girl, they are amazing because they saw past it and they went, you know what, you're right. And I have this editor who I work with there who is a single mom of a son who is 2 weeks older than my daughter. Oh. And she and I have been in lockstep all along, and she's so wonderful. Anyways, I digress. When Guy Stuff came out, I started.
And your son, right, is responsible for the title?
Oh, totally. It was so funny.
I love that.
I was under complete NDA. Like, you can't tell anyone you're writing this book. You can't say a word about this book. Okay. And so I'm writing, and they send me an email. What's your title idea? None. So I go from my office, I go into the kitchen, and he was probably about 9 or 10. No, he's a little older, 11-year-old son. So right in it, right?
I mean, yeah, he's like, I can speak to it. This is my demographic.
Exactly. And I said, his name is Rye. I said, Rye, if I was going to write a book for American Girl about guys, what should it be called? And he looked at me, and the first thing he said, he's like, the company is called American Girl, right?
He said the same thing. You're like, everyone's telling me that.
Thanks for sharing. And he was eating a bowl of cereal, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And I said, yeah, okay, let that go. And he said, it would be called Guy Stuff, because that is the only book I would read. And then he just puts his head back down and cereal. Like, we're done.
Yeah.
The conversation's over.
I gave you my brilliant gem. Now go.
The book comes out and I start traveling around, and I start having these conversations with parents that I had had when I was a pediatrician, that I've had as a mom, that I've experienced things I've experienced in my own home, but now it was coming from people all over the country. And the conversation was really, they don't talk. Right. They don't talk. They shut down. And so this is great, and I will hand them this book, but how do I engage them in conversation? Because this feels impossible. And it became very clear to me what I needed to write next. And that is where Decoding Boys comes in. And it's been a very interesting time to be talking about this book and sort of the nexus of what it is and what it means to have a conversation with your boys. Because of course, all of our children have been trapped at home with us. My experience as a parent has been very similar to the experience of other parents who are sharing sort of what's going on under their roof. It's been the opposite of what I would expect.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking, you tell me.
Boys are opening their door and they're talking more. And the question is why? And I think
the way you just said that, you're like, I'm dubious.
Yes. Can shelter at home never end?
Right, totally.
The only silver lining. My theory, there's no data, this is my theory, is that so our boys, listen, our kids, independent of gender, our kids wake up in the morning, they leave the house, they're gone for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. They come home at the end of the day, and depending upon not their gender, but their personality, their temperament, their hormones, the family structure, all these different variables, some of them want to talk and talk and talk, and some of them want to go into their room and shut their door and
Yeah.
tune the world out.
Decompress,
And
right? Yeah.
decompress. And in my experience, generally speaking, girls fall into the first group and boys fall into the second group, but not always. There are a lot of girls who shut out the world, and there are a
Mhm.
lot of boys who talk and talk and talk. And I've met those kids, right? And so, but generally speaking, I think it's partly a hormonally mediated strategy for, I'm done right now and I just need a moment. But that moment might last 3 or 4 hours. And if they have a phone or a computer or a laptop or whatever in their room, it gets complicated. That being said, now they're home all day long.
Right.
And I don't think they need the break in the same way. I don't
Yeah.
think the strategy serves them in the same way. They shut themselves in their room plenty, but
Right.
we're the only people they have to hang out with.
Right.
So they are starting to hang out a little bit more with us, because at its core, when you look at human nature and teenage development, teenagers need to connect in real life with other people. And their preference is to connect in real life with other teenagers. And
Yeah.
they'll let you know that loud and clear. But if there are no other teenagers around, you might be a decent second. And,
Right. If you're
that's
like a
fine.
nice, kind of funny person who can,
Yeah,
keep up.
exactly. You're
Exactly.
fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you think some of it is related to social pressure of having to be performative and have that kind of mask to fit in socially? And now that they're home and they don't have to kind of gear up for that, that there's more relaxation? I mean, I know that's not with everyone. I have friends whose kids are, their anxiety's through the roof. So I know that, but I'm just wondering if you think that's.
It's a great question. I think that's probably a driver for many. I really do. And now that things are loosening up a little bit, it's also interesting to see where they're all landing.
I told you about Build Up Boys and how it's a program for 4-year-olds to 14-year-olds. And one of the big components is pre-puberty and puberty, and wanting to create a space for boys to talk about their emotions within the physical context, even as little kids. Like, where do you feel anger in your body? How do you know you're starting to get really upset or jealous? Like I was driving my 4-year-old to a play date, and he's in the back and he goes, I feel nervous. And I said, oh, why? He goes, I don't know, I just feel so nervous. And I'm like, okay. I go, where do you feel that in your body? And he said, my eyeballs. Like, I don't know what to do with that information, but thank you. But just this kind of connection between the body, the emotions, that expression of emotions. And I loved how you talked in your book about hormones, because for someone who's not a STEM person, I've always been a creative, acting, storyteller, writer. Sometimes that can feel confusing. Like, okay, so the thyroid does this, and if you have adrenal fatigue, it means this. So it was really cool the way you explained like the system. And so I'm curious, and this is the longest kind of talk question, but I'm curious how you feel the hormones dictate gender versus the social construct of gender, and what you've seen in terms of that intersection.
Right. So what you're asking in the medical world would be a question about genotype versus phenotype.
Okay, thank you.
So genotype is, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and one of those is the sex chromosomes, and you either have XX or XY. Those are the genes, the genetic blueprints for everything that's going to happen in your body. The genes encode proteins, the proteins build different organs and systems, and they all communicate by these chemical messengers called hormones. So typically an XY individual, and I say typically because there are a lot of things that can go wrong along the way, but typically an XY individual develops testicles. Those testicles will eventually produce testosterone. That's what happens in puberty, is the
Right.
testicle machinery just kicks in.
Right.
They become testosterone factories. That testosterone is a hormone that then impacts everything else in the body. So it's, it's just a general messenger, and it's shifting things in one direction. If you're XX, The dominant hormone is estrogen. It's also progesterone and other hormones as well. Estrogen, again, floats all over your body and impacts all of your cells in another direction. So the genotype is the instruction code. It's the blueprint for how things are sort of encoded to work and what hormones you probably are supposed to, I use that word very cautiously, manufacture. Your phenotype is the expression on the outside, what it actually looks like. So there are, for instance, people who they have an X and a Y chromosome. They make testosterone, but the testosterone has no receptors anywhere in the body. You're lacking the receptor. So even though all this testosterone is floating around, it can't be received, it can't be seen, and therefore its impact is not felt. And what's interesting about
And
that
that
is,
happens at puberty. It doesn't happen earlier than puberty.
well, we see it at puberty, right?
Okay.
Because we have very small amounts of testosterone that float around before puberty, but we see the impact when you're supposed to see secondary sex characteristics developing, and suddenly you're looking going, this is a very, very, very late blooming boy, what is happening?
Right.
And then you begin to realize, oh, and this is one of many examples of why your genotype and your phenotype, the way things are expressed, might not match up.
When I was talking to Michael C. Reichart and Michael Ian Black, they were talking about some insults they've gotten is soy boy. The idea if a male has too much estrogen, then they present more female.
That's right. Although I will say that's one of those ill-informed insults.
You're like, that's not even a smart insult.
It's not even a thing, because I mean, it turns out that soy does not have, it has phytoestrogens, but those aren't estrogens. They're estrogen mimics, but they're not estrogens like the estrogen in our body. And we know they don't work like estrogen in our body because there are entire countries that subsist entirely on soy protein for their protein source. And it is not a country full of women, right? It is a country.
I love that.
Right. So it's such a weak insult. So anyway, so to your point, so the expression of gender, and I talk in Decoding Boys in the introduction about how the book is not a book about gender.
Yes.
And I say that very expressly because I think gender is an enormous conversation and an extremely important conversation. But it's so big that I don't think you can tackle typical development and issues among kids who are developing along one path at the same time as tackling a different path of development or expression. I think that's unfair to both parties. I think there should be content for both groups of kids and both groups of parents. So I didn't want to not focus on one in order to honor the other, but I want to make sure it's clear that there's a lot of white space in the gender conversation, especially among pediatricians, and that white space needs to be filled because kids with who are on the gender spectrum may or may not have gender dysphoria, and whether or not they have gender dysphoria, they then sort of how we approach what their lived experience, given the social constraints and the social norms that are placed upon them, given what happens in school settings with bullying and sort of what we would consider not normal but predictable child behavior, which is sometimes microaggression and sometimes macroaggression.
Right.
That's a book. That's 3 books.
You're like, that's someone else's book, not my book. Yes, and I recognize that. But I will say that I think your approach and you're helping parents have the conversation about puberty. And I loved what you said about, to some extent, the genitals are different and there might be like a tampon discussion or a something, else discussion, but that mostly the books are pretty much the same. And that if we do start talking to boys early, and if we do give them the space, that also might help change some of the gender construct, right?
Oh, sure. Right. And the other thing is we are raising our children in a very different world. I do think it's taken a lot of effort on the part of society to rewrite gender norms. But I also think Gen Z or sort of certainly the kids who are teenagers today, they don't see gender the way our generation sees gender. They just don't, which is a wonderful thing. The thing that I have found very interesting among all the kids that I've spoken with over the years is as they individuate and as they form their own opinions, this is one area in which they're really diverging from their parents. And so I do think what you hear from a 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old and what you hear from a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old is markedly different, because the 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old is parroting what they're hearing at home.
Right. They don't have the ability to be like, well, I actually think this. Right.
They don't. And so that brings me hope, because as I watch what this younger generation is standing for, what I am seeing is when peer influence comes into play, when the kids turn 12, flip in the brain, suddenly parents, not important. Friends, very important. That peer reinforcement in many, many parts of this country, not all, but many,
right.
Focuses on a new definition of gender. And it's a really, it's a great thing.
What would you say for parents out there now? And obviously you have your book, but like in this interview, for pre-puberty, what do they need to know? Let's say they're dealing with it now and they're trapped in a house with their kids. Like, what kind of advice would you give? And what do you think they need to know in order to have more agency and peace within their bodies?
Okay, so let's start with acknowledging that there are a number of levers at play that are going to impact how any one person manages information in their home. What are those levers? It's everything from the personality of the parent and the personality of the child, to the birth order, to the number of kids and adults living under the roof, to the ability to have quiet time and have individual conversations, to economic stressors, social stressors. You know, you've got the crazy uncle who's got the whatever comments in the background, right? There are variables. And so there isn't going to be one piece of information or one piece of advice that I can give that I can say, this works for all families.
I love that. Right.
Okay.
I like that.
That said, I really believe that knowledge is power. I really believe that the more open your lines of communication, the better it is all around. But I also believe that sometimes too much is too much, meaning when your kid tells you they're done because they didn't really need to know all that information, right? Yeah. Yeah. So when they walk away in the middle of the conversation, which they do, okay, you're done.
Yeah.
And telling you, oh, that wasn't my question. So, right, I'm good for now. I don't want you to feel as a parent like, oh, I didn't finish and I need to go back there right now. The only other thing I was going to say about how you engage a prepubescent kid is when a child comes to you and asks a question and you as the parent go, I do not know what they're asking me or why they're asking me this, ask them. So for instance, where did I come from? Okay, that question from a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old mean 4 totally different things. You may think you know what your child wants to know, but maybe it's better to say, hey, that's such an interesting question. What made you think about asking me that? Because one of those kids may say, well, Jimmy told me on the bus, and spill a whole narrative about,
right.
Okay, got to go there now.
We need to talk to Jimmy's parents.
And one of them may come up with sort of a random, well, I heard this and I just wanted to know, did you birth me or did someone else birth me? Or, whatever it is, they might have a very specific question. You're thinking like, I got to teach intercourse. And they're thinking like, I just want to know who, what my birth story was or whatever it is. So,
right. Like I didn't need to know about the egg and the sperm and maybe the 2 men together have to borrow the egg. Like, just right.
Or maybe they did. And so just ask them.
Let's say the kid doesn't come with a question and and have started to see a change in behavior, change in voice, change in something. What can you do to initiate conversation?
And that's by far the most common scenario.
Right.
Like,
You're going to open that slam door. Right.
If you have a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old at your house right now and you're thinking, oh my God, my kid never asks me questions, that's normal. Okay, so
Right.
just
to normalize, right?
Set the stage here.
Yeah.
So one of the most important things that we can do as parents is to begin the conversations. They do as we do, not as we say. And so if one of the things we do is engage them on a regular basis, then they come to expect that we're going to engage them. And it's an interesting thing. So my own house, I will tell you that I do a pretty good job. That's what I do for a living. I do a pretty good job of engaging my kids. But my kids accuse me all the time of never listening to them and never being interested, which is fascinating.
You're like, because that is not my experience.
And I'm so deeply offended. And then you begin to realize, but that's their experience, because it's not that I'm on a phone not listening to them. It's that there might be two people in the room and I'm trying to balance the two voices, and their voice isn't the loudest one to me. And they're saying, you're not listening to my voice first. So it's very interesting. It's you do need to start the conversations. You also need to kind of call your kid out. And occasionally when they go, well, you never listen to me, or you never do. Yeah, no, this is what I do 24 hours a day. And this is
like, all I do is listen to you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's important. I think that's important. And remember that it's a developmental stage, this whole phase of puberty, where it's like they're the sun and we are the planets revolving around them. It's just like when they were 3, right? I mean, it's identical.
And especially if they're competing, right? If there's a sibling, like you said, because my kids will fight, like, I was speaking, now I can't remember. And they'll just like flip out. So would you recommend also, if there are important conversations that you're engaging, to try to find space to do that?
You have to. Okay. And what I find myself doing at home, especially in pandemic, is saying things like, okay, stop. I hear you. I want to have that conversation. Let's put a pin in that. And then now we're going to talk about this one first, right? So there's some of this back and forth, this navigation, because why is it that when they finally want to talk, they want to talk at the same time?
Same time. Yeah. And it's so important then, right now.
Right. And you're losing your window, Mom. You don't talk to me right now. Before we can
ever.
Yeah. Oh my God. So you do, as a parent, have to be prepared to start these conversations. What I would suggest you do is follow, that the Ross Wiseman advice about how to ask questions and what questions to ask is really, really invaluable advice. Open-ended, not too open-ended. Sometimes too open-ended ends you nowhere. But a yes, no will get you a no and you're done. So open-ended, not the same question every day. I watched a podcast recently, loved it, about a dad who every night said, what was hard for you today? So I tried it at the dinner table the other night, and I was like, guys, what was hard for you today? And they were like, oh God, what podcast were you listening to? So that doesn't work in my house, but I thought it was a great question. So some parents may want to try it.
You're like, meanwhile, so proud of yourself. This is going to generate such an interesting
I was like, oh my God. I said, well, it changed everything in this person's life. And my kids are like, yeah, well, it's making us laugh at you.
Yeah, exactly. Just stop.
The advice that I think you can carry with you and not forget as a parent, because sometimes we hear all this advice and we're like, I want to write that down and I'm going to forget it. This one's easy. Okay. Grab a teachable moment. So grab a teachable moment.
Yes, I love that in your book. I thought that was brilliant.
It's critical. Yeah. So you're driving down the street and you see a bus with a completely inappropriate ad, story of our life every day. Call it out and have the conversation right then and there. You're watching a show with your kids and something comes up that's just downright wrong. Press pause. Talk about it. You are listening to music with your son or daughter and the words are not dirty, but the content is horrible.
Right.
Stop and talk about it. You got to grab your moment. Some parents are afraid to go there. Some parents think, why should I point it out? If I point it out, I am going to then teach my child, you should feel this way.
You should feel ashamed. Right.
I don't believe that. I don't buy that for 1 second. That's like saying sex education causes sex. No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
So there's this fine line. Parents need to parent. Our
Yeah.
job is not to be our kids' friends. Okay. It's not what I'm advocating, but parents need to parent kids who are, every generation is remarkably different from the generation that preceded it. And so the generation that is keeping the younger group safe and healthy is also a generation that has not evolved to a certain place. When Greta Thunberg sort of hit US shores in the
Yeah.
fall, she really made a big impact in my house. And the reason was not even her climate change stance, which is very important, but it was her comments that how dare our generation, yours and mine,
Yeah.
um, say it's up to the next generation to take care of it.
Right.
She's
How
like,
dare you? Right.
we're still kids. It's on you for now, and then we'll pick it up where you leave it off. And my kids really found that powerful. They said, that's what we're trying to tell you. And that's right. And that's why, yes, it's our job to set the rules and the limits and keep them safe and do all these things, but it's also our job to continue to evolve and grow as people, because they're not ready to get the baton yet.
Yeah, I love that. And then the last thing, and then I'm going to let you go because I don't want to monopolize your time because I know you're busy. The idea of biology as destiny. I think biology was treated as destiny for women for so long. Like, you can't be in the workforce. You can't do this. You don't have stamina. Women have proved men in the world wrong about what they were told they could or could not do. And so I'm just curious if you have an opinion on that, given that your education is so steeped in biology and understanding the hormonal relations and how that expresses.
I don't think biology is destiny, but I think biology is very impactful, right? So I wrote a whole book about how, while there's no data, testosterone must be somehow connected to what we see uniformly across the boy community as they're going through puberty, which is retreat and quiet. If it was entirely socialized, we should see it shift and change over time. There has to be some biological component. That being said,
How do you think that translates to violence?
well, so we do know very clearly that testosterone is connected with violence and aggression. Testosterone is a very powerful drug. So is estrogen. And the data is there in spades that when people have more testosterone on board, they are more inclined towards aggression. Doesn't mean that they exert it. And while we know that genetics play a tremendous role,
Right.
what epigenetics says is you've got a blueprint in every cell of your body, and your blueprint and my blueprint are different. Based upon the environments we live in, both micro and macro, based upon all the things around us, the things we put into and onto our bodies, we shift the way that those blueprints turn into designs, the way those genes are expressed. And so it's not that biology is destiny, but biology is the scaffolding.
Yep.
And then the world in which we live is what determines how that biology is expressed. And certain things are mutable and certain things are not.
Right. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about how many home environments are not safe,
Well, that's right.
right? And the abuse that happens and the pain and socioeconomic differences and systemic racism and like all the things, when you think about how important that environment is for the expression, how many kids don't get a chance, right, to express more positively, let's say.
And it's not fair. And in the same way that school breakfast and lunch should be healthy, because it's not fair if they're not.
Right, because they don't have food. Some people don't have food.
In the same way that you should be paid the same amount for the same job, independent of your race or your gender.
Yeah.
These are drivers that impact the biological expression of genes as much as anything else, as much as the type of deodorant you wear, or the chemicals in the shampoo that you're using, or the food that you're putting in your mouth, and maybe more so in many ways.